now. I
Oh,
just
we
got
are live.
confirmation from
Fantastic.
Discord. We are live now. Yep.
Fantastic. All right, everyone. Welcome to our session on AI. And this is a bit of a wide-ranging topic. I'm well aware that depending on the course that the discussion takes, we may have very different paths to explore. My name is Yudhanjay Vijayaratne. You can call me Yudha. I'm a Sri Lankan science fiction writer and data scientist. And joining me today is apparently a motorcycle outside, but more importantly, joining me today are four fantastic people who have taught a lot about artificial intelligence and I would say robotics in many of the works that they've talked about, discussed, explored in their professional careers, and have come at it from very different angles. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. So let's start with Adrian.
Hello, my name's Adrian Tchaikovsky. I mostly write books about spiders, but I have a generally wide-ranging interest in non-human intelligence in all its forms. If you'll excuse me, I'm just going to faff with my lighting briefly while other people introduce themselves. Sorry about this.
Right, and while Adrian sorts out lighting, that was fast. That just made it a lot more dramatic. Come back. Right. Shall we go to Benjamin?
Sure. Yes, I'm Benjamin C. Kinney. I write science fiction fantasy. I've had short stories out in many fine places, Analog, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Strange Horizons. I love talking and writing and thinking about artificial and inhuman minds because by day I am a neuroscientist. And yeah, that's what I'm here for. And I'm also the assistant editor at science fiction magazine Escape Pod, which is up for Hugo Award finalist this year. Yay.
Fantastic. Can we go to Bradley's?
Yes.
I'm hoping I got your name correct.
Yes, you did. Yes,
please
you
tell
did.
me.
Thank you. You did. Thank you. So my name is Baralis Martinez, and I'm the author of the forthcoming experimental chapbook Cookie Song, which is forthcoming in 2023 from Mason Jar Press. I'm a reader for Uncanny Magazine and Bodega Magazine, and I love robots for a long time, and I write about them. And right now, one of my projects is about an android and a human survivor in a post-apocalyptic world traveling together and exploring what it means to be human.
And last but not the least, on my screen, PJ.
Hi, I'm PJ Manny. I'm a science fiction writer, and I just completed the Phoenix Horizon trilogy. Last book comes out next week. The first book, pardon me for showing because I love these covers so much, Revolution, which was nominated for a Philip K. Dick Award. Identity was book 2, and now Conscience comes out next week. They cover the world of brain-computer interfaces, artificial intelligence, robotics, and I come to artificial intelligence through the idea of artificial general intelligence, coming up with thinking machines, and what happens with the premise of uploading. Not that I think it's going to happen. And I'm sure Benjamin and I can go round and round on this. But the idea of what does it mean to be human, and what does it take to think, and how does our thinking change in different substrates?
Fantastic. And well, I suppose I should declare my biases and interests as well. I work with a bit of the stuff in my, well, day-to-day job, and I write science fiction about artificial intelligence, and I also write science fiction with machine learning tools that I build and customize. Some of them are transformers retrained, some of them are tools that I built from scratch. So it's always fascinating to see other people who are in the space and thinking about it, because a lot of us come at it from very, very different framings. So firstly, framings. And I'd like to put PJ and Brother Lee's on the spot for this. As when we say AI, a lot of what pops into people's heads automatically seems to be Terminator and Skynet. But where are you coming at this from? What, if I may, is your definition of AI? Where do you approach it from? I know it's a large question, but what comes to mind when someone says AI to you?
For me, artificial intelligence, the problem is that everybody has a different definition, including the people who work in the field. And we can look at what's referred to as narrow AI, which we use every day and is involved in all of our choice making through the modern world. But I'm more interested, for me, and I address the narrow AI, but I'm more interested in how AI problem solves. How do they problem solve human problems? And that's the part where we start getting sticky because it really doesn't exist yet. And some people believe it may never exist. Some people believe it absolutely will exist, that there's nothing to the laws of physics that say it can't. So for me, in my work, I really am looking at how is thought changed? How our choices, decision-making trees, how is that all changed through the various ways we define artificial intelligence?
Right. And Brother Lees, where do you come at this from?
I'm going to come from media representation since I'm more familiar in that area. So for me, AI is something or someone constructed. You know, it's a projection of what's acceptable and what's undesirable from the society. For example, the 1975 version of Stepford Wives, where the female automatons replaced the women in the community, representing a counter-revolution of second-wave feminism. So for the men that in that movie, it's their construct, their projection of what a wife and mother should be to them. And AI can also be considered a threat. There are some or the fear of the unknown. You have movies like The Iron Giant, the giant robot that came out of space, and people are afraid of it. And of course, you know, you could, of course, some people refer to the Frankenstein connection, which is a man creates something, and that creation turns back of them.
Right. So a lot of at least a lot of depictions of AI seem to come with a while ago I was sort of trying to explore where we get the idea of robots and where these concepts originally stem from, and it seemed that everywhere I looked, whether it was to the golem or whether it was to Tyndalos of Greek myth or to Frankenstein or even to even more pop culture versions like Skynet, it seems to start with the idea of a servant. And in fact, this is also reflected in policy literature like Professor Joanna Bryson's Robots Should Be Slaves narrative. So it seems that it comes from the idea of a servant, and coupled to that very tightly is the idea of the rebellion, the idea that what we create will eventually break against us, which I suppose is the fear of any parent, that what we create and love the most will eventually rise against us, or any slave master for that matter. So given that this is such an overwhelming strain of the conversation, what tropes are you interested in, or what substrains of this particular narrative are you most intrigued by in your work? And I'd like to put this question first to Adrian, because I've seen the machines that, for example, well, coming from my recent reading of your work, the machines that Dreyfus creates, particularly some of the stuff where the repeating crossbow, the what was it? It's almost cavalry, the armored cavalry that has legs and basically thinks. And he says, no, these are handlers. They're not drivers. The people driving this stuff. Handlers seem more appropriate. So you seem to be thinking. So what's most interesting to you?
I mean, for me, it's that tipping point that may or may not be genuinely possible with any kind of technology we're ever likely to have, where you go from the point of having a very complicated decision making algorithm, which is kind of what Dreyfus has got, as far as Dreyfus has got, which isn't bad given that he started off working with crossbows. He's doing a good job, but there are limits with him. But obviously, we are currently looking at a technology where you can get a very complicated marketing algorithm that can work out exactly what you might want to buy, although it doesn't seem to be able to tell the difference between wanting to buy another comic and wanting to buy another fridge, for example, because it will advertise you another 20 fridges if you buy a fridge. But there's a boundary beyond which is some sort of genuine intellect. And I mean, for me, that's where AI really picks up. It's not what we've currently got, which is kind of in the field of AI, but it's that idea of this is the thing that is making an independent decision. And at that point, I think where what I'm interested in is the morality of, well, what do you do with it? Because if you have a thing that thinks like as we can think, or in any comparable way to the way that we can think, then if you are having it only as a servant to do a task, then that is slavery and that is a problem. So that for me, it's the what it might be like to be that self-determining non-human thing, whether it's artificial or an augmented animal or something just from another line of evolution entirely, and what it is moral for humans to do with it. And my book for this is based very much Dogs of War, where it's cybernetically augmented animals under the focus. But those are the moral questions I'm looking at.
And I was reading Peter Watt's Blind Side, and I think it was there that I came across, well, that I started thinking of every good AI story as a first contact story, because we are essentially thinking of something fundamentally alien that does not think like us at all, but now we need to interrogate it within our fiction. And Watts particularly has a completely strange and alien creature that is possibly more adapted to deep space than the human civilization, but has no sense of sentience or individual units at all in the language that it uses, how it functions. Benjamin, what draws, what strains of this draw you the most, because you're professionally involved in working with machine learning as well. So what do you find most fascinating, and what do you find most fruitful, and what do you find most unexplored possibly?
So there's so many answers to this question. I was taking a few notes as other people were talking, and I've got like 7 notes here of things that I want to talk about. I won't go
It's
into all
interesting
of them.
that Cheng has not come up yet, but I want to
Yeah,
throw him at you at some point.
I could spend a whole panel just talking about Blindsight, but that book. The I think there's a real sort of critical, sort of moral question. This first contact question of how do we handle these things that think in a way that counts as a person to us, though it may not be a thing that thinks the way we think. I mean, if it thinks exactly the way we think, then then it's obviously a person, and it's not a difficult moral question, and it's also not as especially interesting story, because then it's just another person that you've put a funny hat on. And trying to find these boundaries of where do we think it's this what qualifies as this, I think Adrian put it as having some sort of genuine intellect, this general artificial intelligence. I tend to think that intelligence is not even the right question, that it's more along the lines of consciousness, which is of course already 10 different concepts packed together. Is it having an internal narrative? Is it having a subjectivity? Is it something else about having, ability to be flexible and creative and innovative rather than following programs? And because there's so many unanswered questions, this sort of big question of when do we become the slave drivers here, is to remember that is to look at human history and remember that humans are really good at dehumanizing like actual humans. And we need to be really careful about saying, no, that thing that behaves like a human, it's not really human, is an extremely dangerous thing to be doing. And that drawing the boundaries widely for what personhood is sort of an important endeavor to go on. And the one other thing to add,
Absolutely.
one other thing to add quickly, separate from that, is one thing that I do bring in this academic knowledge from this. It tends to be less about machine learning directly and more about the human mind, and really seeing how the sort of theories and knowledge about how the human brain works and the ways in which it does and doesn't map onto the things that that happen, that are the ways that different kinds of artificial constructed minds and brains might work. There's a lot of there's a lot going on in there, which we'll get back to the brain uploading question at some point, but not right now.
Well, I mean, absolutely. Like one of the most famous problems in AGI in the field in general is this question of, well, forget the Turing test, but the idea of how do we know that something is conscious if it can respond to us in a manner that we cannot tell apart from a human being participating in intelligent conversation. Do we know whether, how do we ever understand whether it's self-aware or not? And conversely, if we look at the weight of history and all the remorseless pieces of metal that we put into each other's bodies over the ages, even if they are, I mean, even if they are self-aware, are we going to treat them with the respect that they deserve? So in this context, what works do you think? What works would you put forward as having explored this concept of personhood, which you touched on, that which I think all of you really touched on, that has to be expanded, and this idea of what are these things, what is artificial intelligence actually going to be used for, and what are the moral and social implications of this technology coming to practice? What works would each of you put forward, particularly from recent times, as having explored these in a rather in a very interesting or thorough manner? I'd like to put this to all of you, actually.
I'm quite intrigued by the marriage of human-like thought and larger machines. So I'm a big fan of Anne Lecky's Ancillary series, where the ships, we're all like, yeah, where the ships have human thought, and that thought is distributed between different bodies, different ships, human bodies or human-like bodies. And that's something I play with in my books as well. I love the idea that this is intelligence, and it can be the same intelligence, is distributed, but that doesn't mean it's shared. And because we're all having, each of those entities are having their own experience. So they may make the same judgments generally or have the same values, but experience changes them. I love that they're the iterations, there's endless possibilities of the iterations.
A couple of authors I'd put forward. The first one, particularly for just the fun value of the AI involved, is the character of Trouble Dog in Gareth Powell's Embers of War, which is a warship AI that's kind of been evolved out of a dog's brain. So it's a very dog-like spaceship, which is now working and preferring to work as a rescue ship. So you have a lot of investigation of an AI that did basically was involved in some fairly terrible war crimes when it was doing what it was told, and is now basically making it has made a moral stand itself on what it wants to be used for. The other author, I think, is one of the absolute all-time greats with AI, is Justina Robson. A while ago, she had a book called Silver Screen, which is a really good, very sympathetic story of an AI that again is seeking to avoid being used for the wrong things. But recently, she wrote an incredible novella called Paper Hearts, just in the last year or so, which answered the question: well, what if we got an incredibly powerful AI to basically fix the world? Which is that question you always, if only we had a huge AI, it would solve all of our world problems. And it is basically the story of us having an AI and it trying to solve the problems, and all the problems that come from it trying to solve the problems.
I suppose we might end up with Ian Banks' culture then, where we have an almost post-conflict society, and everybody at the fringes is a bit of a nut, and they're kind of bored, and they're looking at, and that's the edge cases are what makes the story. Bradley, what would you put forward as truly interesting?
Well, first off, I want to show this book. This is Anatomy of a Robot by Despina Kakodaki. She's a professor at American University, and I highly recommend reading her book and her articles on her website. It's because of her that my view of robots have expanded and about AI. And also my writing, I love to read stories about human relationships with AI, particularly androids. Um, One example is A Close and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers, which also includes interactions between an android and other AI,
Yes.
which is something that I don't really see too much of. And also, other than video games and films, I've been seeing a lot of indie web comics also exploring humans and androids teaming up, learning what it means to be human, exploring trauma and whether a robot can experience trauma and respond to it. And I want to do a shout out to there's a webcomic recently, it's still ongoing. It's called Crepa by Natasha Dancy. It's on Webtoons, and it's a post-apocalyptic England. A medical droid and a lone survivor, a girl. They travel, and there's an exploration of past trauma there. I highly recommend it. Also, Sky by Cynthia JS, which is another human android team up in a futuristic dystopian world. And also, sorry, and also there's a logo by Chase Niels and Miranda Bull, which is androids being used as sex workers.
Yeah.
And there's an anthology called Kind of Love, also on Webtoon, and there's a story, which is a love story between a Roomba, it's called Roomba, and Alice, which is Alexa. And it's so clever. It's actually really clever because the way they interact. There was the Roomba who was trying to get Alice to respond, and Alice respond with music, with "Thank You" by Dido, "Memories" by Maroon 5 to respond to him. So yeah,
This almost reminds me of the Facebook experiment where they had two chatbots facing each other, basically talking to each other, and they ended up stripping out so much of what we would consider language and basically just sending almost digital noise at each other, but somehow made sense within the databases that they were accessing. So, Benjamin, what would you put forth? I have a few.
He's-
No, I have a few items on my list as well, and I'm hoping that you either take them off or I'll have to jump in and say that.
These are all great recommendations. I'm gonna hit two very quickly so we can keep moving through more stuff. One of them is Charles Stross's Saturn's Children, which is it's a very odd book in some ways. But it has a fascinating thing of these robots who were designed to serve humans living in a solar system where the humans are all gone, and what do they do about that? And the creation of a human is terrifying because if one existed again, they'd all have to obey them. And so humans are a terrifying concept. And I really want to point out, like, short fiction is where a lot of great weird stuff is being done nowadays. I could talk for days. I want to specifically point out Eric Schwitzgebel, who is a philosophy professor in his day job. His story, Gaze of Robot, Gaze of Bird in Clark's World, is about an AI that is explicitly not conscious. And the story is all about getting you to empathize with that thing anyways, and getting you to love it, even though you
That's very
know it is
interesting.
just a machine. Yep.
That's a very interesting angle. I'm going to put just one more thing on the table then. Ted Chiang's life cycle of software objects, which to me is, of absolutely fantastic exploration that really holds up in terms of what we have in the state of the art. So we're getting some very interesting questions in chat as well. What do you find, what annoys you the most? Now that we've discussed sort of examples of what we think is good, what do you think is bad? And I'll put my foot in the frame first. I find Asimovian three laws robotics stuff crap. Very, like, incredibly incredibly outdated crap just based on a very deterministic understanding of programming that's sort of rooted in the 70s, 60s, that's basically deterministic, one programmer sitting away typing lines of code, which is not how machine learning models today work at all. And that's my pet peeve, and that's what I generally explode at. What do you find incredibly lazy?
The Turing test.
Sorry, let's go with PJ first.
Sorry, I just blurt things out.
Yeah.
No, the Turing test. The Turing test is complete nonsense.
We broke it with Eliza.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that also goes back to what you were just saying about the story of empathizing with something that clearly isn't human. That's what we do. We anthropomorphize everything. Every creature we come in contact, every inanimate object. So the Turing test itself is complete nonsense.
Yes.
I put googly eyes on my toaster, and its
it...
name is Bob. And
there you go.
Right now, right?
Yes.
Like that's a classic. Yeah.
And the fact that we could, like in the 60s, with what is essentially almost an undergraduate coding project right now, in the 60s, we could break the Turing test completely.
Yeah.
It shows how little value it has. Adrian, sorry.
No, I was the thing that annoys me when it gets trotted out, as it does on a fairly regular basis, is just purely, well, it's the AI that immediately wants to destroy its creators, kind of for no reason. I mean, sometimes you get there. I mean, I'm on that camp that kind of feels the monster has fairly good grounds for wanting to put an end to Frankenstein, frankly, but the idea that there is just something inherently malicious in that non-human sentient, and as soon as you let it off the leash, the one thing it'll want to do is completely destroy us. And the problem with that is that is projection.
Yes.
That is nothing but human projection. And there's still, oh god, I have a whole thing in Firewalkers. There's an AI, and it notes that, well, in the 21st century, a lot of very powerful, rich people were saying, well, we can't possibly have AIs. These things are monstrous, and they have no connection to people, and they don't value human life, and will want to destroy us. And the AI is basically, well, projection much.
So that's inept thinking then.
Yeah. Inapt and inept.
If I can just add to Adrian's Frankenstein mention, one of the things why Frankenstein is so powerful is really it's a story of parenthood and the negligent parent. And the reason we empathize with the creature is because he has been abandoned and abused, and he can do a whole lot of things that we look upon and go, well, that is monstrous. But we empathize with him because Frankenstein is he's the bad dad. He's Percy Shelley. He's William Godwin. He's every dad who never wanted to take care of a kid or change a diaper. Every dad who's like, yeah, you'll figure it out, go away. And I think Mary nailed it in such a universal way that we're still telling that story. And Adrian's AIs are still a response to that. They're going to be monstrous because we don't take care of them properly.
And when we're talking about the limitations of talking about the laws of robotics as any kind of useful tool for discussing AI, one of the useful ways it is useful, though, it's probably the first example of do as I say, not as I do, which is the way that people seem to, we've got to make sure that any future AI acts in a moral way. Whereas if you had something that was an actual AI and you were telling it, well, you mustn't do this, this, and this, the first thing it would do is look around and work out that, well, you do it all the time. And, the idea that an AI must be given these very rigid prescribed moral limits is an astonishing piece of hypocrisy from the point of view of humanity.
Absolutely. And we are now getting some very interesting questions in the chat, and one of them I'd like to bring out here.
Yuda, before we go into those, I want to add one thing to the tropes you don't like is lazy or stereotypical one.
Sure, go ahead.
It's one of my favorites, and it's gonna start fights. But for me, it's brain uploading. No,
you didn't.
Did because
these are fighting words, man.
So, as a neuroscientist, my belief is that the brain is a machine for generating adaptive action, for generating complex adaptive action that lets us survive, to reproduce. There is no computation. We can kind of describe it as computation, but it's like a car is not computing when its components work together to drive around the road. Like, I guess you could describe it as computation, but that will include more things than it reveals. And the idea that what a brain is doing can be transferred into what a computer is doing is like saying you can upload a cheetah onto a race car because they both run fast. Like, they're accomplishing the same ends, but they're completely different things that are just both happen to be achieving the outcome of like complex adaptive action. And you can't, yeah, it is just, brain is more like an engine than like a computer. And therefore
Okay,
uploading
we
it does
are
not make
not
sense.
going to dissect this particular thing because I suspect we will start the next World War over this, and I don't want to moderate that. But I will call on Brother to actually give us what you hate the most about what you see.
Actually, I want to mention this because it's still an ongoing issue, but there's still this tendency to have the androids particularly white or racially ambiguous. And whenever there's a Black, Latinx, Asian, or even indigenous android, I mean, there's the question of what does it mean? What does it mean to be an android that is in its appearance of color, or Black, or indigenous? And I mean, of course, the default is clearly white here, and some writers, filmmakers, etc., have this non-white android. Well, appearance is not consequential. I mean, it's for me, it's not lazy; it's neoliberal. And the thing is, I remember that I was in a panel at another convention years ago, and there was this woman. She's Black, who said something really stuck with me during the Q&A section. And she commented on the portrayal of androids in the TV series Westworld and HBO. And she said that for her, it was uncomfortable to watch violence against Black androids and androids of color because we see that in real life every day. And her words stuck with me ever since. Um, and I love the movie AI and artificial intelligence, but even I have to acknowledge that the default is white there.
Absolutely. And we even see this in contemporary robotics where the default shell is just this clean clinical white. I mean, I will add a pet peeve as well, the lack of human plus AI narratives. One of the most interesting things that I've seen in sort of AI as it has developed in the competitive space is what Kasparov did after he got the chess master Garry Kasparov did when he got beaten by IBM's Deep Blue. He went away and came back promoting a field called advanced chess, Centaur chess, where it was not human versus human. It was not chess engine versus chess engine either, but human plus chess engine versus human plus chess engine, with the idea that the chess engine brought the depth, the data, the expert search systems, the ability to crunch the numbers and questions, and the human brought creativity and free play. And you suddenly found 15-year-old amateur chess players who were performing at grandmaster levels, and some of the best grandmasters have been in this. And in fact, some of the writing that I try to do is trying to explore this. But I would really like to see more of that real life trend being brought in, because we are seeing this in so many other spaces where experts are bringing computer systems now to help them. And the synthesis, I believe, is better than the usual Skynet takes over the world type of stories. So we are now getting questions, and one of the most interesting questions that has popped up is, can the panelists talk about how bias plays into algorithms and how we avoid building AI that mimics human biases that leads to social justice issues? And this is super important. One of the things that we first, for example, when at the nonprofit that I work at, where we do quite a bit of research that then gets into computer journals and conferences, we have this rule of thumb. If you're using American data, for example, There are protected categories, gender, race, and all that, like that you don't consider in any data. But if you're using American data in particular, drop the zip code, because zip code is an incredibly tight predictor of race and ethnicity in America. If you have large enough data, you're bang on with your prediction. So there are certain tools that data scientists use to try and be ethical, like looking at distributions, looking at outliers, looking at, is there class balance in this data set? But so often we see systems out there in the world, systems with far more power than any of us do, that are horrendously broken, sometimes built on completely bullshit theories, and being pushed into governments, which I fear the most, and into systems of extraordinary power to persecute and to police people. So what would you put? What do you have to say about how we might go about minimizing damage, rather?
Can I throw a recommendation, just because it's the book that deals with this in extraordinary detail and in a very kind of readable fashion. It's called "You Look Like a Thing and I Love You" by Janelle Shane. It's very funny in parts, but it also does a very serious deep dive into how these algorithms, even when the people making them don't realize that they are mimicking human bias, how they so often do.
And yes, also like unforeseen consequences is the bane of this type of work.
But it's at every level of machine learning, from iPhones not being able from iPhones only being able to distinguish white faces, to, it's literally from sound, sight, every form of machine learning where we're trying to replicate and then analyze and then come out with a data set of what is this thing we've just encountered. The biases in every single industry, every single interaction that we have with a machine. And this gets back to one of the issues that, and I'm avoiding uploading desperately. But what we're having is this increased merging, and this speaks to artificial intelligence deeply, and bias. We have this merging of machines with people. This is the third lobe of my brain. I do not exist without this thing at a fundamental interactive level with my society. But it's making choices for me that I have no idea about. And it has biases. And because I am American and because I am white, it is making positive biases for me where it isn't for other people, because the input is the output. Whoever is putting in their concepts of what society is, what the world is, how we even interact with it, these are fundamental questions of who we are as humans within a society, within the world, and those biases are inherent in them. I could go on for this. I could do a whole panel on this.
Agreed. And of course there are like a general rule of thumb is, if humans have created the data, which they most likely they inevitably have, unless it's a completely synthetic data set, it is going to be biased. And there are so many ways in which this bias expresses itself. For example, a rather interesting piece of research was when people put the trolley problem to people of different countries. And the trolley problem was, in that particular example, was phrased thusly: if you were if you had a self-driving car, and there was an old person and there was a young person, a child on the road, and the car had to swerve, but it would inevitably hit one of them, which would you be okay with being taken out? And some countries said, well, the old person should die because the young person has more potential. Other countries said, no, the young person has to be preserved. The other countries said, no, the young person is just a blank slate, a tabula rasa. The old person who has accumulated so much wisdom and has so much to teach society should be preserved at all costs. And the problem lies when you have systems created in one set of cultural motifs and mores and then transplanted into the other without any sort of interrogation as to what it is, what kind of system it is that we're projecting. So Benjamin, given that humans are biased, how do we actually, and given that garbage in, garbage out is a thing and has always been a thing and will possibly be a thing as long as computers exist. And given a third curveball, there's the work of, I think, Kleinman and others who posited that mathematically there are three possible notions of fairness: balance of positive class, negative class, and parity between groups, and that we can't optimize for all three fairness conditions in one group. How do we approach even the concept of non-biased data?
I think, I mean, the big question is like, boy, I wish I knew. But there actually is an answer, which is that taking us back to these questions of Frankenstein and parenting is we need to straighten ourselves out before we can be good parents. That's the answer.
Fair. So this comes back in an interesting way to Brother Liz, particularly because because of Frankenstein. Biological AI has come up. The subject of biological artificial intelligences has come up in chat, and I think we have enough time. We have just enough time to discuss what other examples of biological systems may be out there. What have you come across that that the chat might find interesting?
This in the media, this is fascination with what's inside in a robot or an android. Certain things of the android pulling up their face, opening up their mouth wide, opening up their chest. It kind of like emphasizing the difference. Like, I look human, but I'm different because of what's inside me. I'm not 100% biological. I'm not really human. And I also see this in clones and other artificial humans. It You can see there's that movie with Robin Williams, Bicentennial Man. It just came to my mind, and it's this android who wants to be human, and what a piece by piece he gets organs, skin, bodily functions until he becomes fully human and he dies in the end.
And yeah, actually, it's quite rare that that sort of good biological systems are present in fiction. But one book that I wanted to add to the list was Semiosis by Sue Burke, where plant intelligence was a thing, and you very clearly see how different their perception of time is, how different their modes of thinking is, how they perceive themselves as an ecosystem and groups. And it's fundamentally different, and it's alien, and it's terrifying and beautiful. And I think on that note, I should have just enough time to throw my last curveball. You've been very accommodating of the question so far. If you could write, and this is a surprise question that I didn't send you, so I'm sorry if this is a curveball. If you could write the AI story, the ultimate AI story, what would it be about? Without potentially spoiling any of your future books. Because just looking at Adrian's bibliography, there's going to be at least another 5 or 10 books by the time we finish this call that I now have to read. So, without spoiling anything, if you could write the ultimate interrogation of artificial intelligence and the defining work in the field, what themes, what motives would you pick up, and what problems would you choose to interrogate? What tools might you use? What might you draw inspiration from?
It's funny because I just wrote 3 books Um,
I know. I'm sorry. I'm asking.
I know, but I took it from a very specific point of view, and really narrowed what it was. So it is a good question. Um, I would love to be able to write a book after we really have the next step in artificial intelligence, because I can come up with all of the metaphors and all of the what ifs. I could do this for days, but I want to know something about artificial intelligence that I don't know yet. I want some insight that we're only going to gain from our interaction with something truly new, and see where that personally takes my thoughts, because I think about this stuff all the time and I would love some new insights.
Well, I would like to write something where that takes place after humans have become AI, these fleshy prisons are no more, and we have evolved into metal. Uh, that well, unexpected poetry there, but Ben, Ben,
I can see
have
Benjamin's ready to pounce.
Yes, I know.
yes, I can
It's good
see the
because
tension in
my
you.
my answer to this will actually answer a question that came up on the Discord that we haven't had the time to get to. I'm querying about a space opera novel that is full of AI, and somebody in the Discord asked the question, like, have you encountered the trope of a human-like personality just being a subroutine of a much larger intelligence where most of the resources are allocated elsewhere?
Yes, yeah,
What I want to show this novel is how that applies to humans too.
Yes.
nice,
That's
nice,
how
nice.
humans and AIs are alike in that way.
Yes, exactly.
Very nice.
Yep.
I thought then of that scene in Westworld where they open the book and it turns out that the code for actually encoding the data for actually encoding a human is ridiculously small. It's a bit of a plot, it opens a bit of a plot hole at the time, but that was a nice turn. Adrian.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I wouldn't want to tread the ground about, the robots that we have created rising against us, or that clash at all. What I'd be interested in is the idea of an emergent artificial intelligence, because I think if artificial intelligence happens, it's more likely it's going to happen without us realizing it's happened. It's going to happen in some very, very complex system we create for some other purpose entirely. And we will probably not understand why it's going wrong in the ways it's going wrong or what it's doing. But there are almost certainly networks on the planet at the moment in our telecommunication systems or whatever, which are complicated enough to run to which are more complicated than the human brain, that could conceivably be running that could engender that kind of intellect, and what that would be, given that it has almost the ultimate alien evolution to it. It hasn't arisen through that biological chain that we have. What it might, well, if it could want, what it might want, what it would do, how we would react to it, and that would be my, far more than having a thing that we make to be a thinking engine. Having us turn around and find the thinking engine was basically sitting there all along.
Absolutely. I remember this podcast that I listened to. I think it was either an episode of Freakonomics or Radiolab. I'm not entirely sure, but where the person being interviewed said that given how software development is rather iterative, that we're not going to obviously arrive at AGI overnight, but that we might first create something that has, say, the intelligence or awareness of a worm, and then a dog, and then something more complex, and something more complex, long before we get to human. But the real problem would be that somewhere along the line, what is created in one of these iterations might be able to feel hurt and might be able to feel pain, and we would not even know how to recognize it until it was long overdue.
One really important coda to that is that if you look at the way that animal behavioral science has gone, especially under the influence of thinkers like Skinner, the absolute tendency has been to downplay the amount by which animals think. And at the moment, there's a lot of research, including the spider research that led to My Children of Time, that shows us that even comparatively simple animals can do an extraordinary amount of seemingly intelligent problem solving and decision making.
Absolutely. And then more complex animals like, say, octopi, essentially evolve tool use on their own completely without any social web or any cultural moves passed to them, and that's something humanity took a long time to do. So, okay, Brother Reese, if I could now put you in the same trap that I've devised for the others, and say, if you could write your ultimate story, what would it be?
Um, I've already mentioned that I'm working on a novella about a relationship between an android who was a nanny before a nuclear war, and
Hmm.
and and a human girl is a lone survivor. I mean, I don't think it's the ultimate AI novel because it's been done before, but I enjoy exploring relationships and trauma and
And
memory.
relationships are so rarely explored well in this genre as well.
Uh,
It'll be nice to like see more work like that coming out. So, so yeah, I think we have got. I think we've actually concluded the panel, and I'm surprised that we pulled it off on time, given the size of some of the questions that we pulled off, the potential feud brewing here with people who upload minds and people who don't. So thank you all, and thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for answering these questions. There are a bunch of really good questions, and I think Discord is on fire at the moment. So if you want to stay around and ask questions, absolutely fantastic. Thank you. And I shall now hit the end button. See you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.